Some stories don't begin with hope. They start in the cold, where a broken veteran
Hey
finds
there,
a
little
dying
buddy. You
bobcat
doing
kitten on a
okay in
metal
there?
floor, fighting for breath. Jack Carter could have
Wake
walked
up!
away, but something
Wake
wild and
up, little
fragile pulled
one.
him back from the edge.
Are you all
When
right?
saving a life means risking your
Please
heart,
be okay.
would you still hold on? Where are you watching from? If you believe trust can heal even the deepest wounds, like and subscribe for more true stories of second chances. Some stories don't begin with a ray of sunlight or a spark of hope. Some start in the cold, where even the air seems heavy, and the future is a question with no answer.
Hey there, little buddy.
That's how
You
it
doing
was for
okay in
Jack
there?
Carter the day he wandered into the Riverside County Animal Rescue
Wake up!
Center.
Wake up,
Outside,
little
the winter
one.
wind was
Are
howling,
you all
cutting
right?
across the parking lot like a
Please be
warning.
okay.
Inside, everything was silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the far-off clatter of a cage being cleaned. It felt more like a waiting room for lost souls than a sanctuary. Jack was a big man, broad-shouldered, face roughened by sun and time, but his eyes moved with a restless uncertainty, the kind of alertness that comes from too many years spent watching for things that could hurt you. Afghanistan had left its mark on him. Scars no one saw. Nights where he'd wake with his hands clenched. The phantom crack of gunfire in his head. Some people said rescue animals were therapy for men like him. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he was willing to try. Anything to fill the empty space. The adoption area was filled with the familiar noise of hopeful barking, but Jack kept walking, boots echoing down the sterile hallway toward the back, where the medical ward waited. Maybe he was looking for something broken, something that matched the part of himself he could never fix. He almost missed the small steel cage tucked away in the corner, half hidden by a pile of towels and an old IV stand. Inside, curled into itself, was a shape so small it barely seemed alive. A kitten, but not the sort meant for laps and gentle hands. This was a bobcat kitten, its spots and tufted ears marking it as something wild and untamable. Its body was limp, breath a thin thread, chest barely rising. The cold from the metal floor seemed to seep straight through it, drawing out what little life was left. Jack crouched low, feeling the ache in his knees. He could hear the wind outside, pressing at the walls, as though even the world itself was waiting to see if this fragile creature would make it. There was no movement, no mewling, just the faint, fluttering pulse at the throat and the stillness that clung to the air. He reached through the bars, careful, slow. His hands were steady like they'd been in a field hospital far away, working through blood and fear. The kitten didn't move. He touched the tip of one ear, then the thin, spotted side. The fur was icy, brittle. For a moment, Jack thought it was already gone. Death didn't always come with a noise or a struggle. Sometimes it just slipped in and stole away what was most delicate. Something stirred inside him, a memory maybe of friends he couldn't save, of watching life flicker out and being unable to call it back. Was this the same thing? Was it any different, sitting here with a wild animal instead of a brother in arms? He didn't know. He just knew he couldn't turn away. He sat there for minutes, maybe longer, his hand resting on the kitten's side, feeling for any sign, any flicker. The silence pressed in, heavier with every heartbeat. In that space, with the world outside raging and the lights buzzing overhead, Jack Carter found himself praying, not to a God he'd ever met, but to the part of himself that still hoped. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was fate. But as his hand warmed the kitten's fur, there was a twitch. The kitten's eyelids fluttered, so slight Jack almost missed it. Then, with a gasp, The little wild thing pulled in a breath, sharp and ragged, as if the very air hurt. Its body shuddered once, then lay still again, but its eyes, blue and glassy, opened a crack. They fixed on Jack, wild and terrified, but alive. A rush of adrenaline hit Jack, hard as any firefight. His training snapped into focus, mind racing through everything he knew about shock, hypothermia, the fragile line between life and death. He stripped off his jacket, wrapping it around the kitten, then tucked the tiny body against his chest. Warmth was life. That much he knew. The animal's heartbeat, so faint he could barely feel it, pulsed against his palm. Around him, the shelter staff moved with the detached efficiency of people used to seeing things die. "It's wild, sir. You don't want that kind of trouble," one said, voice low, but Jack barely heard. To him, the world had narrowed to the small, desperate weight in his arms. He knew this was no ordinary adoption. This wasn't taking home a puppy or a gentle old cat. This was a battle, a last stand, and the enemy was cold, was silence, was giving up. The question was bigger than saving a single animal. It was about whether life, any life, could claw its way back from the edge when everyone else had given up. Jack stood, the kitten bundled close, and locked eyes with the shelter worker. "I'll take responsibility," he said, words low but certain. He didn't mention the way his hands shook, or how his heart felt like it might crack with the effort of caring again. Some things didn't need saying. He walked out of the ward, past the barking dogs and curious glances, and into the biting wind. Each step felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. But he didn't stop. Not as the cold whipped his face, not as the kitten whimpered softly against his chest, not as the sky darkened overhead. Some stories start with hope, some start in the cold. But for Jack Carter and a dying bobcat kitten, maybe the cold was just the place they both needed to begin. Instinct is a force you can't reason with, and for Jack Carter, it surged in the hours after he left the animal shelter. The wind hammered the sides of his battered Ford as he drove home. The bobcat kitten swaddled tightly in his jacket on the passenger seat. Its breath was so shallow, Jack had to keep glancing over, checking for the smallest movement of its ribs. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through the kitten's fragile body. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting the surge of anxiety that tried to unravel him. He reached his cabin, small, lonely, perched at the edge of a pine forest, just as dusk fell. Inside, the warmth was a blessing, but the sense of isolation pressed in like an old bruise. Jack wasted no time. He cleared a space near the fireplace, layering towels and blankets in a nest. He set the kitten down gently, then hurried to fill a water bowl and grab a heating pad from the closet. The little wild thing barely stirred, but Jack watched for every sign: a twitch of a paw, a flicker of the whiskers, the slow and uncertain rhythm of breath. His hands moved with the kind of precision he'd learned on the battlefield, calm, efficient, but always carrying the undercurrent of urgency. The kitten's ears were still icy, its paws stiff. He cranked up the fireplace, letting the waves of heat roll across the room. At some point, the kitten shuddered, curling a little tighter. Jack saw it, a flicker of life, fragile but present. He leaned closer, his breath fogging in the cold air. Memories came unbidden. Men he'd tried to save in makeshift tents, adrenaline and fear battling for control. He reminded himself that this was different. This was a creature who'd never chosen the fight. The wilderness had chewed it up and spat it out on the metal floor of a shelter. It was here by accident, just like Jack was. Both survivors of worlds they didn't ask for. Night came on fast, snow drifting against the window panes, and Jack barely moved except to tend to the kitten. He warmed broth on the stove, dipped a fingertip in, and pressed it to the kitten's lips. The reaction was faint, a tremor of the mouth, a weak attempt to swallow, but it was there. Jack felt his chest unclench just a little. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper, not because he thought the animal could understand, but because silence was heavier than any words. Outside, the storm intensified, wind shrieking through the pines, rattling the eaves. Inside, the world had shrunk to a small patch of warmth and the desperate effort to keep something alive. Hours slipped by. The kitten would drift close to the edge, breath halting, body limp, then claw its way back. Jack barely slept, checking on it again and again, every hour, afraid that if he looked away too long, the fragile life would be gone. Sometime after midnight, as Jack dozed in the armchair, his head snapped up at a sudden gasp. The kitten's eyes, blue and wild, fluttered open. It locked onto him, and for a heartbeat, Jack felt something electric pass between them, a silent plea, or maybe just animal terror. But the kitten didn't try to run. Instead, it struggled to draw in a breath, mouth opening wide, chest heaving as if it hurt. Jack reacted on pure instinct, scooping the kitten into his hands, massaging its ribs gently, the way he'd done with injured dogs back in the service. He willed it to breathe, to fight, to come back from wherever it had gone. Miraculously, it did. The breath came ragged at first, then a little stronger, a little steadier. Jack felt his heart race with relief. In that moment, the decision was made. He would fight for this creature, no matter how wild, no matter how impossible the odds. He realized, deep down, that the line had been crossed. This was no longer just about therapy or filling a void. It was about survival. Its survival and maybe his own. The night wore on. Jack half awake, half dreaming. He remembered battlefields and hospital tents, remembered the feeling of saving a life with nothing but grit and stubbornness. He remembered failure, too. The times he'd lost someone despite everything he'd done. But this time, the outcome was still unwritten. This time, he had a choice. Morning crept over the horizon, gray and cold. Jack had barely slept, his body aching, eyes burning, but he didn't care. The kitten's breathing was steady now, its body finally warming. He felt a wave of cautious hope. As sunlight touched the cabin windows, he knew with certainty. He wasn't just caring for a wild animal. He was fighting for both of them. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world silent and white. Inside, Jack and the wild kitten were caught at the fragile edge between life and death, holding on, refusing to let go. By the time the pale morning light crept into the cabin, the storm outside had settled into a hush. Snow glazed the pine branches, and the world looked softer, as if the violence of the night had never happened. Jack Carter, bleary-eyed and stiff from a night spent half awake, watched over the Bobcat Kitten as though the little creature's fragile breaths were the only thing keeping the universe in balance. For the first time since leaving the shelter, he allowed himself a hint of hope. The kitten's body, so limp and cold the night before, was now warm beneath the bundle of towels. Its breaths came slower, steadier, as if it were just another house cat curled up beside the fire. Jack moved quietly around the cabin, making broth and cleaning up the makeshift hospital corner by the fireplace. He tried not to think about the things that always haunted him, those memories from Afghanistan that crept in whenever his guard was down. Instead, he focused on the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of the kitten's side, the flicker of its whiskers as it dreamed. As the hours stretched on, a sense of peace settled in. Jack refilled the water bowl, draped another blanket near the nest, and for the first time, let himself imagine a future that wasn't so cold and empty. The wild animal at his feet wasn't just surviving, it was fighting to live, and Jack was a part of that fight. But as night fell, the shadows in the cabin seemed to thicken. The air grew colder despite the fire, and unease crept back into Jack's mind. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but a part of him knew peace was always temporary. He pulled his old army jacket tighter around his shoulders and knelt by the kitten's side. It was sleeping deeply, breath barely audible. Jack checked its gums, still pink, a good sign, then reached for his notebook, scribbling down what he'd done that day. Fluids given, temperature checked, broth offered. He found comfort in the routine, in the act of documenting, as if writing it down might make the good outcome more real. He dozed in the armchair, the fire burning low, when suddenly, just after midnight, a strange sound cut through the silence. Jack jerked awake, heart pounding, instincts on high alert. The kitten lay sprawled awkwardly in its nest, mouth wide open, eyes rolling back. For a second, time seemed to slow. Jack's brain flashed back to the trauma bay in a dusty field hospital, the desperate gasp of a wounded man fighting for air, the awful, helpless stillness that sometimes followed. Jack sprang into action, adrenaline flooding his system. The kitten's tiny body convulsed, legs jerking, foam bubbling at its mouth. Seizures. Jack had seen it in animals before, in the field and on base, but never with something so small and wild. He scrambled to the kitchen, snatching a plastic syringe and filling it with water and a little sugar, improvised dextrose, the best he could manage at this hour. He returned, knees sliding on the wooden floor, and forced a drop between the kitten's teeth, then another. The body shuddered, tensed, then sagged. Jack wrapped the kitten tighter in the towels, sandwiching it between heating pads he'd scavenged from old camping gear. He grabbed an old oxygen canister from his closet, a relic from a hiking accident years ago, and rigged a tube with trembling hands. The mask was much too big, so he cupped his palm around the kitten's nose, letting the faint hiss of oxygen flow over its face. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Jack's hands shook as he whispered encouragement, half to the kitten, half to himself. This wasn't the clean, clinical emergency room. This was raw, desperate improvisation in the dead of night. He measured breaths, counted heartbeats, did everything he'd learned as a combat medic. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass, and Jack felt the old sense of dread pressing down on him. Failure. Loss. Not again. Suddenly, the kitten spasmed once more, chest fluttering wildly, then let out a tiny, rasping cry, a plea or a protest. Jack felt his own breath catch in his throat. The kitten fought for air, body arching, then slumped, exhausted. Jack willed it to keep going, his hands refusing to let go, even as hours slipped by and hope thinned to a thread. Eventually, the spasms eased. The kitten's breathing steadied, uneven but present. Its eyes fluttered, not with trust, but with the wild terror of an animal dragged back from the brink. Jack collapsed beside it, drained but unwilling to sleep. He stayed like that until the first light of dawn, numb and shaking, unsure if he'd done enough. That night changed everything. The illusion that this was just about caring for a stray was gone. Jack realized the truth. He wasn't looking for a pet to heal him. He was locked in a battle for life, caught between hope and the shadow of loss, as much a patient as the little wild animal he fought to save. In the silence that followed, as the fire faded and the world outside turned to ice, Jack Carter made a silent promise. As long as there was breath, he wouldn't give up, not on the bobcat, not on himself. For the first time in a long time, he chose to fight for life, no matter how wild or impossible it seemed. The dawn after the second collapse was gray and thin, casting long, uneasy shadows across Jack's cabin floor. Jack Carter hadn't really slept. His nerves were taut from hours of battle, body and mind both battered by the ordeal. Yet in the quiet hush of morning, the Bobcat Kitten was still alive. Curled up beneath a patchwork of towels, chest moving in a soft, uncertain rhythm. Jack felt a wave of exhausted gratitude, mingled with fear for what came next. He moved carefully, tending the fireplace, heating broth, refilling the water bowl. With each action, he tried to restore order to a world that had once again been thrown into chaos. Jack was used to chaos. Afghanistan had made sure of that. But this felt different. There was no enemy here, no strategy, just a wild animal caught between two worlds and a man desperate to give it another chance. Mid-morning brought the first real movement. The kitten, no longer so cold or still, began to stir, twitching its tail, kneading the blankets with trembling paws. Its eyes opened, narrow slits of wary gold, and fixed on Jack with raw, primal suspicion. For the first time, the wildness was undeniable. This was no house pet, no docile patient. It was a creature built for survival, and it woke not with trust, but with fear. Jack reached out, slow and deliberate, remembering every lesson drilled into him about handling the unpredictable. His hand hovered, palm open, ready for acceptance or attack. The kitten sniffed the air, then, in a blur of motion, lashed out. Tiny claws raked across Jack's wrist, sharp as razors. Pain bloomed bright and immediate, but Jack didn't flinch. The animal's survival instinct was in full control. Another swipe, then a bite. A quick, panicked snap of teeth against the heel of his hand. Blood welled up, trickling down Jack's fingers and staining the towel. The pain was nothing compared to the sudden flood of memories. Sand, smoke, the metallic tang of fear. In an instant, Jack was back in the desert, crouched over a wounded friend as gunfire cracked in the distance, hands slick with blood, adrenaline burning in his veins. He blinked, grounding himself in the present, the snowstorm beyond the windows, the wild animal in front of him. The war was over, he reminded himself, but the ghosts remained, shadows that moved just out of sight, ready to be triggered by pain, by chaos, by helplessness. The Bobcat Kitten scrambled away, pressing itself into a corner, eyes huge with panic. It hissed, a sound raw and desperate, torn between the need to flee and the need to survive. Jack sat back, breathing deeply, letting the pain anchor him. This was no enemy. This was a living thing, terrified and lost, just like he'd been so many times before. For a long moment, the two of them regarded each other across the distance. Man and wildcat, both scarred by battles neither had chosen. Jack felt the sting in his arms, blood trickling from new wounds, and weighed his options. He could stop. He could open the door and let the kitten run into the snow, leave its fate to the cold and the wild. The temptation was real, a way to escape the struggle, the pain, the ever-present threat of loss. But another part of him, the stubborn core that had survived war and come home despite the odds, refused. He wasn't just fighting for the animal's life anymore. He was fighting for his own. for the belief that caring, no matter how hard, no matter how much it hurt, was still worth it. With practiced calm, Jack cleaned his wounds, wrapping them in gauze, fingers moving stiffly. He sat nearby, just within the kitten's sight, speaking in low, steady tones. Not words of comfort, not pleading or threats, just the steady presence of someone unwilling to give up. The kitten glared, tail lashing, muscles tense for flight. But it did not bolt. Not yet. Hours passed, tense and silent. Jack tried to rest, but every movement from the corner snapped his attention back to the animal. Sometimes it would hiss. Sometimes it would hide its face in the towels, shivering with exhaustion. Jack felt the weight of the ordeal pressing down on him. His mind tugged toward darker places by the pain, the memories, the fear of failure. By late afternoon, the kitten's energy faded. The wild fury ebbed, replaced by shivering exhaustion. Jack inched closer, moving as if in a minefield, every gesture careful, deliberate. He offered water, a sliver of warm meat, and this time the kitten didn't fight. Its head drooped, eyelids fluttering. For a heartbeat, Jack thought he saw trust flicker in those golden eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Then, just as suddenly as it had revived, the kitten went limp, body sagging, breath hitching, life slipping away again. Panic surged through Jack. Had he pushed too hard? Had the struggle been too much? His heart hammered as he gathered the small, unmoving form into his arms, terror clawing at his thoughts. In the gathering darkness, with the wind picking up outside and the cabin sinking into shadows, Jack was left holding a question he couldn't answer. Had he already lost the battle, or was there still a reason to fight? The hours that followed were a blur of worry and exhaustion. Jack Carter barely left the side of the limp Bobcat Kitten, haunted by the thought that he'd lost the fragile battle for life. The small, spotted body lay still in the crook of his arm, too weak to protest, too quiet for comfort. Outside, the world was smothered in snow and silence, and inside the cabin, time seemed to suspend itself in a haze of fear and hope. Jack's mind kept replaying the moment the kitten had lashed out, sharp claws, teeth sinking into his hand, reminding him just how close to the wild it really was. He understood now that this wasn't about taming or owning. The animal before him was fighting for its life in a way that resonated deep within Jack, echoing his own struggles against invisible enemies. Nightmares, memories, the guilt of surviving where others hadn't. In some small way, this creature was holding up a mirror to his own soul. He remembered his training as a combat medic, every makeshift solution, every desperate improvisation when nothing else was available. That night, he used all of it. Jack adjusted the heating pads, checked the kitten's gums, measured its breathing. He spooned drops of water and weak broth into its mouth, coaxing it to swallow with slow, gentle pressure. Every tiny response, a flick of the tail, a twitch of a whisker, felt like a miracle. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jack barely slept. His cabin became a world unto itself, the rest of life outside falling away until there was only this fight, this creature, this hope. The kitten's condition rose and fell in terrifying waves, moments of strength quickly swallowed by exhaustion, brief flickers of awareness followed by hours of deep, unsettling stillness. Jack tracked every sign of improvement, but also braced for the worst. During one of those long, lonely nights, he began to write. At first, it was nothing more than medical notes, a record of fluids given, temperature checks, every observable change. But as the hours passed and exhaustion blurred the edges of reality, Jack found himself pouring more into those pages. He wrote about the storm, about the look in the kitten's wild eyes, about the way fear and hope danced inside his chest. He wrote about Afghanistan, about the friends he'd lost, about the moments he'd spent feeling like he, too, was living on borrowed time. The act of journaling became a lifeline. Each word steadied him, pulling him out of the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. In the quiet between crises, Jack put pen to paper, describing how the kitten's tiny body felt in his hands, how its fight for survival gave him something to believe in. He realized he wasn't just documenting the bobcat's recovery. He was writing the story of his own healing. By the end of the third day, the bobcat stirred. Jack watched, breath held, as the kitten lifted its head for the first time in hours, blue eyes glassy but alert. It licked its lips, shivered, and let out a faint, scratchy sound that barely registered as a mewl. Jack's heart hammered. He didn't dare move or speak. Instead, he waited, letting the animal set the pace. The bobcat shifted on its blanket, legs trembling as it tried to stand. It collapsed again, but this time it didn't go limp. There was life in those movements, a stubborn refusal to give in. Jack offered water, which the kitten lapped at with shaky determination. Encouraged, Jack presented a spoonful of broth. The bobcat sniffed, then took a tentative sip. Every small victory was a cause for hope. Over the next few hours, the kitten gained a bit of strength. Its breathing deepened, its movements more coordinated. Jack remained close, always ready, never pushing too hard. As the kitten recovered, Jack found himself talking to it, not in a way that expected understanding, but as a release for the tangled thoughts inside him. He spoke softly about his memories, his fears, his longing for purpose. The bobcat, wild and wary, listened in its own way, eyes never leaving Jack for long. Slowly, the tension between them eased, replaced by a fragile truce. Jack knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this journey had become more than a rescue mission. The kitten wasn't just an animal in need. It was a living symbol of second chances, of what could happen when someone refused to give up. Jack found his own wounds, the ones no doctor could see, beginning to heal as he cared for the wild thing that trusted no one. On the fourth morning, sunlight streamed through the window, painting gold across the snow. The bobcat stood, trembling but upright, and took a few unsteady steps toward Jack. He didn't reach out this time. He waited, allowing the animal to come to him. The kitten brushed against his hand, just for a moment, then settled beside him, eyes half closed in exhaustion, but alive with the promise of more tomorrows. Jack picked up his notebook and began to write again, not just about survival, but about the bond that was slowly growing between two broken souls, both learning that healing was possible when you refused to let go. By the fifth day, a rhythm settled into Jack Carter's cabin. The Bobcat Kitten, once a limp, near-lifeless bundle, grew steadier with every hour. Its coat had taken on a subtle shine, and its wild, wary eyes now tracked Jack's movements with an alertness that was both beautiful and unpredictable. Jack kept his distance when needed, but he also learned when the animal would tolerate his gentle touch, a short scratch behind the ear, a careful brush of fur when cleaning its wounds. Jack devised a plan, not just for the animal's survival, but for building trust. He set out bowls of warm broth and bits of meat at regular intervals, used his own patience as a tool, and wrote about the process each night by lamplight. He didn't just write about the kitten. He wrote about himself, about what it felt like to slowly open up again even to something so wild and dangerous. In those quiet, honest moments, the difference between man and beast seemed to shrink until it was barely there at all. Each morning, Jack would open the curtains wide, letting in light and the view of the snowy world outside. The bobcat pressed its nose to the glass, eyes following birds, squirrels, and the shifting shadow of clouds. Sometimes, in the deep silence of midday, the kitten would doze in a patch of sunlight, looking for all the world like a domestic cat, but with a twitch of the ears or a sudden tense posture that reminded Jack just how raw and untamed its spirit remained. Then, one afternoon, as the sun faded and dusk wrapped the cabin in blue shadow, everything changed in an instant. It started with the metallic screech of a fire alarm. Jack had been slicing vegetables in the kitchen, the kitten stretched across the rug near the fireplace, when the shrill, piercing sound erupted without warning. For a split second, Jack froze. His mind yanked violently back to 1,000 alarms from his time in Afghanistan. Explosions, chaos, the rush of adrenaline. He gripped the countertop, teeth clenched, every nerve on edge. The bobcat reacted even faster. Its body coiled, fur bristling, eyes wide with terror. In a flash, it bolted across the room, scattering bowls and sending a blanket flying. Jack barely had time to shout before the animal collided with the back door, claws scrabbling for purchase on the wood. Jack stumbled after it, heart thundering, the alarm still blaring overhead. He saw the moment the bobcat found the lever handle, sheer animal instinct taking over. It managed to swing the door open a crack, enough for a cold gust of wind and swirling snow to pour in. Then, with a desperate lunge, the wild thing vanished into the blizzard. Jack burst out after it, the cold cutting through him like a knife. The snow was knee-deep, flakes swirling thick in the air, erasing tracks as quickly as they appeared. He shouted, a strangled cry lost to the storm. Panic clawed at his chest. It was happening again. Something precious, something he'd fought for, slipping away because of chaos he couldn't control. His boots sank in the drifts, hands trembling as he scanned the pale, shifting world. Every shape looked like the kitten for a split second, then blurred into snow and shadow. He called out again, the only answer the screaming wind and the hammer of his own pulse. His mind spun between past and present. Alarms in the desert, the sound of men yelling, bodies lost in smoke and confusion. He fought the urge to collapse, forced himself to keep moving, keep searching. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with cold and fear. He followed faint paw prints through the trees, knowing each one might be the last before the storm erased all evidence. The snow swallowed sound, making the world seem impossibly big and empty. At one point, he stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself on a branch slick with ice. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to anchor himself. The flashbacks pressed close. Gunfire, the thunder of helicopters, friends lost in the chaos. But then another memory rose up. The feel of the bobcat's heartbeat beneath his hand, the look in its eyes as it fought to live. He forced himself to his feet and pushed deeper into the woods, refusing to let the wild thing disappear. He called for it, voice hoarse, promising silently not to give up. It was a battle, not just against the snow and cold, but against the old ghosts that threatened to swallow him whole. At the edge of a small clearing, Jack finally spotted something, a flash of movement beneath a snow-laden pine. He stumbled forward, hope surging, but the animal was gone, vanished once more into the white. Jack fell to his knees, overwhelmed, despair gnawing at his resolve. The storm raged on, the night thickening around him. He wasn't sure if he would find the kitten or if he'd even make it back himself. But he knew, in the marrow of his bones, that he couldn't stop now. He'd crossed another point of no return. The wild had called, and Jack Carter was going to answer, whatever it took. Jack Carter plunged deeper into the woods, snow biting his face and wind howling through the trees. The night was a black curtain, cold and endless. Each breath burned in his lungs, but he pressed forward, boots crunching through icy drifts, hands aching from the cold. He called out only once, just the wildcat's name, which had no meaning, only hope. The wind swallowed his voice, leaving him with nothing but the pounding of his own heart. Every instinct in Jack screamed that he was losing the trail. The storm wiped away the bobcat's paw prints almost as fast as they appeared. His flashlight flickered over ground where prints dissolved into nothing, a cruel reminder of how quickly life could slip through your fingers. The forest seemed alive with ghosts, shadows darting at the edge of his vision, memories layered over reality. The world was war and winter at once, chaos and silence, loss and relentless searching. His mind threatened to unravel as exhaustion set in, but he fought it off with a stubborn, raw determination that had kept him alive through battles far worse than this. He pressed on, weaving between snow-laden branches, breathless, scanning for any sign, fur, a shadow, a sound that wasn't the wind. It would be so easy to give up, easier to turn back, close the door on another loss, let the wild take what it wanted. But Jack's hands were still stained from caring, from fighting for a fragile life. He couldn't let go, not when so much had already been risked. At last, after what felt like hours, he stumbled into a small clearing where the snow lay untouched, except for a dark shape crouched beneath a fallen pine heavy with snow. Jack's heart hammered. He moved slowly, every step deliberate, fighting the urge to rush forward and frighten the creature away. The Bobcat Kitten was trapped, wedged between the trunk and a heavy branch, eyes wild with fear, chest heaving in terror and exhaustion. It had bolted from safety only to find itself more alone, more vulnerable than before. Jack crouched at the edge of the clearing, careful not to make any sudden moves. His breath fogged in the air as he watched the wild thing tremble, every muscle poised to bolt. Jack understood that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after nights racked by nightmares, in the faces of men caught between worlds, desperate for a way out but afraid to reach for it. Slowly Jack slid off his glove, exposing his bare hand to the numbing cold. He extended it, palm up, fingers open. He stayed low, murmuring nonsense softly, not to soothe but to signal that he meant no harm. His hand shook, partly from the cold, partly from the fear of what would happen if he failed now. He let the silence settle, letting the bobcat make the next move. Minutes passed, each one stretching as long as a lifetime. The wind tugged at Jack's jacket, swirling snow across his boots. The kitten's eyes never left his face, suspicious and wild. Then, shivering violently, it edged forward, nose twitching. Jack didn't move. He let the animal come to him, refusing the urge to close the distance, refusing to force the moment. The bobcat pressed its nose against his palm, then recoiled, testing, uncertain. But it didn't run. Its body sagged with exhaustion. Jack saw the struggle, the push and pull between instinct and need. For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance. Finally, the kitten pressed its whole head into his hand, letting its weight rest against him, the ultimate surrender of trust. Jack's breath caught in his throat, the warmth of that fragile life an anchor in the storm. Gently, he scooped the animal up, careful not to crush it, cradling it against his chest. The bobcat clung to his jacket, claws digging in, not in fear, but in desperate relief. Jack staggered back through the snow, every step a battle. His body screamed in protest, legs numb, heart pounding, but he wouldn't stop. He kept murmuring, whispering words meant more for himself than for the animal, promising safety, promising he wouldn't let go. When he reached the cabin, light spilled from the window, golden and unreal against the darkness. Jack pushed inside, slamming the door against the cold, and knelt by the fireplace, laying the kitten in its old nest of towels and blankets. The animal didn't bolt. Instead, it pressed into his hand, seeking warmth and comfort for the first time without fear. Jack sat beside it, trembling, tears burning in his eyes, not from pain or cold, but from something deeper, an understanding that went beyond words. Trust wasn't forged by strength. It wasn't something you could take by force. It grew in the cold, in the hardest places, when hope was almost gone and you refused to give up. That night, as the fire flickered and the storm raged outside, Jack Carter and the wild Bobcat Kitten rested together, survivors in a world that too often took and never gave back. For the first time, Jack let himself believe in something more than survival. He believed in the fragile miracle of trust. The morning after the storm, Jack Carter woke to a world transformed. Sunlight broke through the clouds, dazzling off the ice-laced branches and turning the cabin's windows into glowing panes of gold. Inside, Jack's muscles ached, his body bearing the toll of the night's ordeal. The Bobcat Kitten was curled beside him, pressed close for warmth, both of them breathing in time, tethered to life by sheer will and a new, hard-won trust. Jack's arms bore the marks of his choice, scratches, half-healed bites, and bruises running from wrist to elbow. His jacket was ripped, crusted with frozen blood and mud from his desperate search through the woods. He felt every injury as he moved, but pain had become a familiar companion, just one more price paid for something that mattered. He checked the bobcat's breathing, gentle and patient, resisting the urge to hurry the process. The kitten's eyes, once feverish with panic, now watched him with wary recognition. The fight in its body had softened. It no longer flinched from Jack's touch, though its wildness remained close to the surface. A raw reminder that trust was never a given, only ever earned, and never quite complete. By noon, word of the storm and the animal's escape had reached the staff at the riverside shelter. They called, asking after the kitten and hinting at their doubts. "Wild animals aren't meant to be saved," one volunteer told him, their voice crackling through the static of the phone line. "Even if you could, you'd never tame it. It's dangerous. You're risking too much." Jack listened, his gaze fixed on the bobcat, remembering the cold press of its heartbeat against his palm in the woods. He didn't argue. The world expected tidy stories and safe endings, not the mess of blood and sacrifice, not the kind of pain that left no visible scars. Still, the words stung. He'd been warned before, after the war. Don't get too close. Don't hold on too tight. Things break. People leave. Trust costs more than most can afford. Later that week, the shelter contacted him again. The storm had damaged part of their kennel, and his application to adopt a different, safe animal was denied. Too many risks, too much liability. He felt the blow like a door slamming shut. There would be no easy comfort, no ordinary pet to fill the silence in his home. The price of saving something wild was to be misunderstood, to be seen as reckless or unstable. Jack spent his evenings nursing his wounds, the sting of antiseptic mingling with the ache of loneliness. He sat with the bobcat in the firelight, the animal's shape flickering in the dancing shadows, both of them outcasts drawn together by fate and stubbornness. He found himself telling stories, not out loud, but in the steady scratch of pen against paper. He wrote about pain, about nights when survival was all he could manage, about the guilt of living when others didn't. He wrote about the kitten's struggle, about the defiant strength in its small, battered body. He wrote about the bond that grew not in comfort, but in shared ordeal. Outside, the world thawed by inches, spring threatening beneath the snow. The wounds on Jack's arms healed slowly, but they would scar. People noticed. At the grocery store, a neighbor eyed him with suspicion, taking in the scratches, the haunted look in his eyes. "You should have let it go," she muttered. Jack just nodded, feeling the old isolation close in around him. Still, he did not regret his choice. Every scar was proof that he'd refused to let go, that he'd reached for something fragile and held on even when it seemed hopeless. The pain was real, but so was the meaning he found in the fight. He watched the bobcat grow stronger, its gait surer, its spirit undiminished. They forged an unspoken agreement. Jack would give everything he had to protect it, and in return, the animal would let him close, just enough to remind him what trust could do. One evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, Jack caught the bobcat watching him from across the room, golden eyes steady and unblinking. He felt a surge of gratitude, a deep, quiet knowing that the bond between them was worth every price he'd paid. The world might never understand why a man would risk his life for a wild animal, why he would trade safety and approval for blood and bruises and long, lonely nights. But Jack understood. The meaning he found in that trust was more precious than anything he'd lost. He sat by the fire, the bobcat curled against his side, and wrote the final words of his day's journal. "Some things are worth saving, even if it hurts, even if it costs you more than you thought you could give. Because sometimes, in saving something wild, you end up saving yourself." Spring came slow to Riverside County, arriving first as a trickle of meltwater and a softness in the air, then as green buds prying through the gray snowpack. In Jack Carter's cabin, the seasons seemed to turn more gently. The Bobcat Kitten, once a shadow barely clinging to life, grew steadily, its coat now rich and full, its steps lighter, surer. Even as it gained strength, a wild tension remained in the set of its shoulders, a reminder that some things, no matter how carefully tended, never lose their edge. Jack watched its transformation with a wary pride, seeing in the animal's resilience echoes of his own journey. They had been forged together in cold and chaos, tested by the kind of pain and uncertainty that left lasting marks. Now, as the days stretched longer and the nights grew warmer, a new rhythm emerged, one not built on crisis, but on a cautious, hard-won trust. Each morning, Jack opened the cabin door and let the wild air flood inside. The bobcat would linger at the threshold, testing the world with its nose, reading the scents and sounds of the woods. Sometimes it darted out into the grass, stalking invisible prey, vanishing beneath the ferns. Jack never tried to keep it locked away. He understood, better than most, what it meant to be trapped by fear and circumstance. Still, every time the animal slipped into the shadows, he felt a twist of dread, a silent fear that it wouldn't return. But it always did. Sometimes battered, sometimes muddy, always hungry and wild-eyed, but it came back. Jack learned to read its signals, the twitch of its tail when it was anxious, the slow blink when it was tired, the way it pressed close on cold nights, seeking comfort without surrendering its independence. In time, Jack realized that what he'd built with the bobcat was not ownership, but partnership. A fragile coexistence that honored the wildness in both of them. Word spread, as things do in small towns. Some neighbors still eyed Jack with suspicion, whispering about the ex-soldier and his dangerous pet. But others, those who knew a little of what it meant to come home carrying scars no one could see, began to ask questions. Veterans from the county, some who'd spent years at war and came back to find themselves strangers in their own lives, reached out. Jack found himself sitting on porches and in small-town diners, telling pieces of his story. How a battle-worn bobcat had changed the way he saw the world. How caring for something wild had helped him care for himself. "Never call life over too soon," Jack told them, his voice steady even when his hands shook. "You never know what you'll save. Maybe not just a broken animal, but a part of yourself. If you don't give up, miracles happen." The words were simple, but the meaning ran deep. He shared what it felt like to see death up close and keep reaching for hope anyway. How the fight to save the bobcat became a fight to find meaning after everything else had been stripped away. He showed the scars on his arms and the journals he'd filled, proof that healing didn't come in a straight line, but in moments of grit and grace and stubbornness. In time, the story caught the attention of local counselors and veterans groups. Jack was asked to speak to others dealing with PTSD, to share not just the details of war, but what came after, the long, hard road back to life. He found purpose in those conversations, the kind that made sense of pain, the kind that turned private struggle into something that could lift others up. Through it all, the bobcat remained a silent companion. It never lost its wildness, never became tame or predictable. There were nights it would disappear into the forest, gone for hours, sometimes days, before returning with burrs tangled in its fur and stories written in the mud on its paws. Yet it always came back to Jack, drawn by the strange gravity between two survivors who had refused to give up on each other. Jack learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or banishing pain. It was about living with it, letting it shape you without letting it define you. The bobcat, wild and free, was proof that some wounds could never be tamed, but they could be carried with dignity. Their shared fate was not a happy ending, but a true one. An acceptance that some things are always wild, always half-broken, and always worth saving. As the summer sun finally crested the ridge and the woods filled with birdsong, Jack and the bobcat stood together at the edge of the trees. He thought of everything they'd survived: cold, pain, loneliness, the weight of being misunderstood. And he felt, for the first time in a long time, not just alive, but at home. Jack became living proof that PTSD wasn't a life sentence. It was a challenge, a wilderness all its own. And sometimes, the best way to find your way back was to trust, first in something fragile, and then in yourself. As the seasons cycled through green summers, red-gold autumns, and back to the bracing wind of winter, Jack Carter's story quietly took root in the community. At first, it was just whispers, of a veteran living alone at the forest's edge, of the wild bobcat that came and went from his porch. But as months passed, the truth of what had happened spread further than Jack could have imagined. It found its way into veterans' groups, animal shelters, and even the local news, carried on the voices of those who recognized themselves in Jack's battle. or in the wild eyes of the animal he'd saved. Jack didn't seek attention. Most days, his life settled into a pattern as steady as the seasons. The bobcat, grown sleek and strong, lived half in the woods and half in Jack's world. It would vanish for hours, sometimes even days, always returning with the dusk, circling the porch before settling beside the fire. Sometimes Jack found himself waiting, heart clenching in his chest until he heard the soft thump of paws or the brush of fur against the door. Their routine was wordless but deep, a rhythm that belonged to both the wild and the wounded. Yet something in Jack had shifted. Where once he would have recoiled from connection, now he opened his home to old friends, to fellow veterans, even to curious neighbors. He shared pieces of his journey, never dressing up the struggle, never pretending that his pain had disappeared. Instead, he spoke plainly about the nights he'd spent alone in the dark, wrestling ghosts. About the mornings he'd woken to a heavy weight pressed against his side, a reminder that trust, once earned, could anchor even the most broken soul. One crisp Saturday in early spring, Jack was invited to speak at a local gathering for veterans. He nearly said no. Stage fright clawed at his gut. But the thought of the bobcat and what they had survived pushed him forward. He stood before a modest crowd in the old town hall, scarred arms crossed, eyes sweeping faces etched with the same mixture of hope and weariness he saw in the mirror every morning. He told the story from the beginning, how he'd found a dying creature on a cold steel floor, how he'd fought to bring it back when everyone said it couldn't be done. He spoke about the setbacks, the seizures, the injuries, the fear that trust could be broken with one wrong move. He described the moment out there in the storm when he realized that saving the bobcat wasn't just about healing an animal. It was about finding a reason to care again. Sometimes, he told them, the wild teaches us how to return to life. His words rippled through the crowd. Afterwards, men and women lingered to talk, not just about animals, but about their own battles. The nights that felt too long, the feeling of being lost, the moments when hope seemed like a distant country. Jack listened as much as he spoke, knowing that sometimes what people needed most wasn't advice, but the proof that survival and even healing was possible. His story sparked an idea among the local shelter staff and counselors. What if, instead of simply adopting out animals, they could pair struggling veterans with rescues that needed just as much patience and resilience? Jack was invited to help pilot a program, one that would give others the same chance he'd found, to save and be saved, to forge a bond that made sense of all the pain and stubborn hope. Over time, the project grew, drawing volunteers and funding, connecting people and animals who might have otherwise been written off as too difficult, too wild, or too broken. Jack's cabin became a quiet symbol of second chances. Sometimes visitors came to meet the bobcat, hoping for a glimpse of something miraculous. They would see instead a wary animal who trusted only Jack, who never quite surrendered its wildness. And that, Jack realized, was the heart of what he wanted to share. That healing didn't mean losing who you were, or erasing the parts of you marked by hardship. Sometimes, the most important thing was simply to survive together, to let trust build slowly, day by day, in the space between fear and hope. He wrote in his journal every night, adding a question for those who might read his story. Have you ever trusted something fragile and found it changed everything? Have you ever fought for a life others said wasn't worth saving, only to discover it saved you right back? Jack never expected answers, But sometimes letters would arrive from strangers, veterans from across the state, young people struggling with grief, even former shelter volunteers. They shared stories of battered dogs and street cats, of loved ones lost and found, of the ways life could turn on the smallest moment of hope. Looking back, Jack understood that he and the Bobcat had never truly saved each other alone. Their bond had become a message, a living, breathing example of how the wild in all of us could be the start of something new. It wasn't an easy life, or a story with a simple ending. The scars on Jack's arms remained, as did the darkness in his dreams. But each day he woke to the sound of paws at the door, to the promise that trust, once given, once returned, could change everything. In the end, he left a note by the fire, a call to anyone who heard their story. Sometimes the wild teaches us how to return to life. If you've ever reached for something fragile, if you found yourself changed by the act of caring, share your story. You never know whose life you might help bring back from the cold.